right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out to this second installment of Q&A, Ask the Editor. I am so thrilled to welcome Hattie Fletcher, Managing Editor of Creative Nonfiction Magazine, fellow Pittsburgh local. So Creative Nonfiction does a ton of things, but today we are primarily going to focus on the magazine, but we'll talk a little bit about the many programs Creative Nonfiction offers. But just an overview, Creative Nonfiction Magazine is true stories well told. Each issue demonstrates the depth and versatility of narrative nonfiction and proves that smart, engaging narratives can make any subject fascinating and meaningful. The magazine has consistently featured prominent authors from the United States and around the world, and in its 24 years has helped launch the careers of some of the field's most exciting writers. Creative Nonfiction has a circulation of 10,000, which in literary magazine world is like basically like a gazillion, and serves the whole spectrum of readers from nonfiction and journalism enthusiasts to poetry and fiction writers, editors, and agents. Creative Nonfiction is printed right here in Pittsburgh, PA. And Hattie Fletcher, of course, is the managing editor of Creative Nonfiction Magazine. So again, thank you all so much for coming out and joining us. And Hattie, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Oh my gosh, happy to.
So things are good? Are you feeling okay and doing all right in all this pandemic craziness? Crazy climate?
Things are okay. Yeah, I mean, it seems, you know, it's been more than a year now since I've been in our office, but this morning I was looking at proofs for our issue number 75, which will be the third issue we'll have printed since, you know, like winter 2020. So we had a little bit of a, you know, we kind of bobbled for a little bit, and there were a couple of yikey months there at the very beginning, right? When no one was quite sure what was going to happen. But yeah, I think we've been fortunate enough. So we're an independent nonprofit. We're not at a school or anything like that. So we've been sort of fortunate enough to get some emergency funding. We got
great.
the CARES Act funding from the National Endowment for the Arts. We got a little bit of funding from Pennsylvania, did some emergency funding, and then we got some paycheck loans and everything, which fortunately they extended to nonprofits. So we're doing okay.
Doing okay, yeah.
It's sort of nice, yeah.
Yeah, that's
thankfully.
Great. Yeah, and so does that funding get spread out over all the different programs, or is it going primarily toward the magazine?
It's a lot of different things. So some of it, the really important thing for us, I think, is partly the rent. We actually had just moved in January to a slightly kind of bigger, but also modern, weird space. That was a little more expensive than our old space. And so a lot of like the federal funding can cover rent and stuff like that, which is great.
Yeah, now that you're all doing Zoom, it's good to be paying rent. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not, I mean, it's not like, what would we do with the space anyway, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the big puzzle. But other than that, yeah, it's been good. And I think we're also, I know we want to talk about the magazine, but we do lots of education programs, and we had already sort of started doing some virtual programming or some sort of like hybrid programming. So we had a little bit of a leg up on, you know, having a digital platform and having a little bit of practice with it. So we've been doing weekly webinars, and there's been like a nice audience for those. I think really sort of nice thing all around. And that was a good thing for us too, because it gave us something stable to do.
Sure, yeah, it's great.
Really concrete to do every week, which was sort of really nice also.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I'm so glad you guys are thriving. Yeah, it's really great. I forgot to mention, folks in the participants, you're welcome at any time. Just type in, if you have questions, just type them into the chat and I will try to work them into the conversation as we go. So anytime. So I just wanted to back up. I think viewers, some might be familiar with the genre of creative nonfiction. Some folks might have MFAs in creative nonfiction or have studied this, and some people might have no idea what creative nonfiction actually means. What's the difference between creative nonfiction and an op-ed or a lyric essay or memoir? So I just wanted to hear from you, how do you guys conceptualize this genre? What defines creative nonfiction?
Yeah, that's a great question and a good place to start. I mean, I think really for us, you know, that phrase we use on the cover of the magazine is something that has been really helpful. It's just true stories well told. I think one of the sort of unfortunate things with the term creative nonfiction is that, you know, for a long time, and I guess sometimes for some people still, there's kind of this idea that the creative is modifying the, you know, the nonfictionness of the nonfiction. And so there's sort of, you know, that long running debate that's sort of like, it's just making things up, which is not really what it is. The creative, I think, is sort of modifying the artfulness of the nonfiction. And so really for us, I think creative nonfiction functions best as sort of an umbrella term that really covers a whole lot of different kinds of writing. If you look sort of historically, I think there are sort of two different paths that have led to creative nonfiction. And so one of them, which our founding editor, Lee Gutkin, talks about a lot, is sort of the new journalism of the 1970s, right? Where part of what happened is that you had these writers who in some cases really explosively and in other cases, you know, like a little more quietly sort of came to question things like journalistic objectivity and the idea that, you know, that there's sort of no one behind a story, that it's just sort of like the truth spoken onto the page. And there were these writers, you know, Joan Didion and Tom Wolfe and Norman Mailer, who sort of brought more of themselves and sort of had a clearer angle. And so then the nonfiction also sort of in some craft ways a lot of times too was very, you know, wasn't just objective and dry and sort of had a personal angle, but also did all kinds of crazy things with language. And, you know, if you think about sort of early Tom Wolfe, right, it's just like zooms in the middle of sentences and things like that. But I think there's also this older strand, you know, that in sort of, especially like MFA nonfiction world, you hear a lot about Montaigne and the personal essay and sort of that long history of stories that are also, again, based in reality, but have, you know, a stronger personality, have a sense of often kind of questioning memory or, you know, just a really firm grounding in kind of one person's perspective and the uncertainty of that. And I think creative nonfiction as it stands now really kind of encompasses all those kinds of writing. I'm not so interested in, we try not to do a lot of pinpointing what writing is. You know, you can kind of have all these big debates about like, well, is that lyric or is it a hermit crab or is it it doesn't really matter. I don't think a whole lot. They're, I guess, sort of useful terms sometimes, but really it's just, you know, like I said, it's true stories well told. And so there are stories that are grounded in, you know, some kind of objective reality. I think we firmly do believe in that. And then we believe in people's different perspectives on that reality and sort of the stories that we shape from it. In practice, Creative Nonfiction Magazine, I think, has a little bit more of a narrative bent sometimes than some other magazines. And so we do publish kind of a whole range of things, especially these days. We've kind of, we have a newsletter that does flash pieces, and then kind of the magazine is like mid-range pieces. We actually have another magazine that's on hiatus right now, but that's called True Story, that does long form narratives. And so kind of the whole gamut of, you know, like nonfiction stories and storytelling.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Thank you for that definition. Tom Wolfe is actually one of my all-time favorite writers, and I never kind of connected the thread between him and new journalism, and I like Hunter S. Thompson and those guys, and creative nonfiction as like a developing ongoing genre. So that's really cool and interesting. I also, funny you mentioned the hermit crab essay, because I had no idea what that was. And I was just looking at, so this is Creative Nonfiction's latest issue. It's really beautiful. And I was flipping through it and I saw a friend of mine actually, in the magazine has like a kind of experimental section at the experiments in nonfiction. Mm-hmm. And is that in every issue, or is that?
It is in every issue, yeah. And it's, you know, it's a little bit of a problematic space in the sense that, I mean, who's to say what an experiment is? I will say, you know, it's something that we wanted to do, this incarnation of the magazine, which we redesigned in, I think, 2010. We're actually coming up on another redesign. So I've been thinking a lot about this, but that one, we definitely wanted to have a space for sort of more out there creative, really creative pieces. And so one solution for us was to kind of open up a space, and then we do a specific call for that, just for sort of experimental writing. And we're very clear, you know, like, what's experimental? Who knows? Yeah. I mean, every essay in some sense like sets its own rules and experiments in different ways. I'll say when we do that call, though, it's some of the hardest reading we do, because you really do have to figure out sort of, okay, well, what is this piece trying to do? In a more obvious way than you have to with a lot of other writing, you know, sort of like, well, what are the rules this piece is setting out for itself? Sure. What's it trying to do? Does it do it? And then there's this added layer, which again is always a layer, but it's a little more in your face. You know, does it need to do all these things that it's doing? Like, if it's an essay that kind of takes all these forms and shapes, is there a reason for that? And sometimes you go through the reading and sometimes there's not much reason for it. You know, you're sort of like, this is a really clever structure, but like, why is this essay shaped with a lamp? It doesn't have anything to do with anything, you know? So it's kind of an interesting thing, but it's fun. That section's really fun. And
yeah. Well, it was interesting because I asked my friend about this. I said, oh, I saw that you had this piece in creative nonfiction. She said, oh yeah, that's a hermit crab essay. And I had never heard the term until yesterday, which, if people don't know, it's a essay that uses a pre-existing form, right? Is that it? So,
yeah.
The essay, or the piece in here, was based on a resume. And so she told a story about herself and her parents using the structure of a resume. And I thought that was really interesting. And I was sort of wondering how much you guys envision the magazine as a teaching tool for students or professors in the genre, or is it primarily for readers, or just for anyone?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think something that we've realized is that the bulk of the magazine's readership, though not exclusively, is people who sort of are interested in writing at some level too. And so when we stumbled on this iteration of the magazine, like when creative nonfiction was started, it was a really, I have some here. Hang on. I'll show you.
We're getting a sneak peek of early issues.
So the really early ones, for the first, like, I don't know, 10 years, it was like this. I mean, it was like really a literary journal. And it came sort of out of this idea that Lee had, partly when he was trying to get creative nonfiction to sort of take off, especially in English departments, it was a bid to make it seem more serious, because everyone was like, this is silly, it's not anything. And he's like, well, if there was a journal. And so the first one was really just collections of essays and sort of things like that. And then what we realized, though, was that a lot of our audience was interested in sort of writing tips and the writing life and kind of craft pieces and things like that. And so the magazine, as it stands now, is a little bit of a hybrid. So it's kind of like, we think of it as a cross between like Poets and Writers, you know, which is really about writing, but focusing on the genre. But then the thing is, the NEA did a study, I don't know, a while ago now, 10 years probably. But one of the things they found was that more people reported that they had written in the past 6 months or something than had like read creative writing, which I think is one of those kind of paths you can kind of go down, right? You can subscribe to the writer, Poets and Writers. You can get really like locked up in kind of like writing about writing and not actually reading writing. And so we thought, you know, what would be really interesting is to do a magazine that kind of offers really excellent reading and also sort of gives it that context of writing about writing together. And so that's that's been sort of an interesting way of looking at it for us. So the experimental thing in that sense is ideally, you know, there are people who read it and just sort of like it. And I think there are also people who are approaching it trying to be a little bit more analytical about the genre or about writing or looking for examples. And that's awesome too.
That's great. And we had a question, which is, what is the average length of submissions that you're looking for? And also with that, if you could sort of just generally take us through your editorial process, that would be great.
Sure. Like I said, we're redesigning, so we're sort of working on re-envisioning some of these things, but it's not, you know, it's not sort of going to change in a huge way. So creative nonfiction is, I think, pretty much like a standard literary magazine in the sense that usually what we look for in submissions is, you know, there are, in the kind of more commercial magazine world, you're usually pitching ideas, you're kind of working a little bit more collaboratively from the conception with an editor, whereas literary magazines are usually more sort of looking at something you've written and deciding whether or not that thing is a fit for the magazine, right? So that's most of the kind of reading we do. We tend to put out kind of specific calls for submissions. So partly to just kind of manage the flow of the pieces that come in, and partly a lot of the issues of the magazine have been kind of on a theme. So we'll put out a call. I'm trying to think. That one, the most recent issue, The Moments of Clarity, actually when we did it because it was in a different world, it was, the theme was power. They're not unrelated, but I think given sort of the year that 2020 was, we looked at the essays and they were all good essays, but they weren't about power in the way that you would at the end of 2020 have expected an issue that was like power to sort of address some other things. So we kind of pivoted a little bit, but so we'll put out a call for a theme, usually for creative nonfiction. The maximum word length we ask for is up to 4,000, sometimes 4,500 words. There's really no short end, except practically speaking, we don't usually publish too much stuff that's below 1,000 words. We read what happens when submissions come in. We have a team of volunteer readers, like 20 or so volunteer readers.
Wow.
At least 2 people kind of look at every essay, and then we tend to, with our readers, trust at that point, you know, if 2 people are like, this is obviously just not right at all, at that point we'll kind of screen things out. They go through then an associate editor. I usually for an issue look at between 30 and 50 essays, I would say, and then an actual issue has 5 to 9 essays in it. So it's a lot of just reading and sort of you know, figuring out what kind of fits and what doesn't fit. Practically speaking, I think for me, it's a little bit, you know, part of it, you're looking for surprises. Sometimes with the themes, one of the challenges is that there are actually kind of a lot of, there's a lot of overlap in what comes in the submission pile. And so in that way, I kind of recommend, if people are really interested in sort of putting work out there, it's really useful if you can find a literary magazine and help them screen submissions. I think it's one of the best things you can do as a writer, because it gives you a real window on kind of what people are sending and what it looks like. And I think practically speaking, a lot of times, especially in nonfiction, you know, obviously everyone's story is sort of a whole different story. But practically speaking, a lot of our experiences are, you know, they're often kind of similar, right? Like a lot of the really dramatic points in a life are, you know, unless you're fabulously lucky or fabulously unlucky, like they're kind of a lot of the same points, right? Like having children is very dramatic. Having parents die is very dramatic. There's sort of, you know, things like that. And so what you see is that people write about those intense life experiences, which is great. But a lot of times it's helpful to read broadly and see how people are conceiving of those experiences. And if you're trying to write about one of those experiences, what it is about your conception of it that is different in some way. So a concrete example of that, which is actually easier to talk about than like life and death, is like travel abroad, right? Like a lot of people travel abroad during college, or did, I guess.
Hopefully we'll again one day.
Right. Someday maybe they will again. Anyway, and travel abroad is an awesome thing, right? It broadens the world. You see whole different ways of living. It tends to happen at a point in life when you're also really open to that and like to, you know, having your mind blown and all those things. It's really helpful to remember though that at any given time there are a whole lot of like 20-year-old people who are having that same experience. And so like I landed and everything was different is amazing and incredible, but it's also really common. And so figuring out how to tell that story in a way that isn't just like, right, you traveled abroad is really sort of like a useful thing to be able to see. So you read the submissions and this, I think, gets a little heightened sometimes by the way we do it. So we do an issue that, you know, a theme like, I don't know, we did a marriage issue once, right? And somewhat predictably, there were kind of categories of things, right? There were sort of like wedding prep stories, there were divorce stories, there were, you know, sort of all those things. And so then making the final issue is partly an exercise in also figuring out like which of those are the best ones, because obviously it's not, if we set out to do a marriage issue, it's not all a wedding prep issue, right? So the wedding prep essays, we're going to take one, maybe two of those, because part of the idea is to kind of like create a story of a larger experience. And so when I get to that point where I'm reading 30 or 50 essays, I'm really kind of thinking, you know, it's like a little bit an exercise in like, I don't know, like building a mixtape, right? Or something like that, where you're sort of like, are there some shorter pieces? Are there some longer pieces? Because everything that's like a 4,000 word story that just kind of starts and has an arc and ends, like it would be a very boring issue. And so the exercise for me at that point is figuring out kind of what's the mix and how do the pieces play together and what does it all add up to as a story? And so that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think that's so important for writers to remember too, that when a piece is rejected, so often it may be because the piece is not quite ready, which surely happens, but also it might be that it's just repeating a piece that has already been accepted in the magazine, or it's a page too long for what the magazine is trying to put together, and that the editors are trying to curate an overall effect. And so your piece might just not fit, and it's not a reflection of the piece's quality. It's just what the editors are going for that issue.
Right. Totally. Yeah. We had one time in our submission pile, I guess we did a best of brevity issue once, and there was a piece in it by Sonia Livingston, and it was about thumb sucking actually. And right around that same time, we got another awesome piece in our normal submission queue, and it was also about thumb sucking. It was also really good. They had actually some real commonalities, and I did in that case. I had to write a rejection. I was like, this is awesome. You're never gonna believe.
Just change the theme of the issue to thumb sucking.
Right. Like, unfortunately, we really just published an awesome thumb sucking piece. But that does happen with, you know, sort of things that was just like sort of a ridiculous example.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So question, do you all publish vignettes and or flash nonfiction?
We do sometimes in the magazine. We also, like I said, we started, I guess a couple of years ago now, an email that goes out on Sunday mornings. It's called the Sunday Short Read. And it's a mix of new original work and work from, I think 4 other magazines at this point. So there are pieces from Diagram and Brevity and Sweet, and maybe River Teeth. But we publish original pieces there probably once a month. And those are all under 1,000 words. So that's been probably the most intensive amount of flash we've published. And that's been an interesting experience, because I think I would have said before, really doing a lot of the editing for the Sunday Short Reads, I would have said, you know, it's all nonfiction, it's all editing, it's all arranging words, but they are a little bit different. The sort of constraints and patterns are a little bit different, which has been interesting to kind of.
And there's also the tiny truths, right? I don't know if that would be
right. And we do that too. We do, and we've done that for, oh my gosh, so long now. Yeah, we do a challenge, an ongoing challenge on Twitter that is to tell a story in the constraint of a tweet, which now I think is like 280 characters, right? And those are also really interesting.
They really are. They're awesome. It's
yeah.
incredible what people can capture an entire life in a tweet.
Yeah, it's really fun. And I will tell you, when Steven Knezovich, who's our marketing director, suggested doing that, it was, you know, it was a long time ago in Twitter years, especially too, but I thought it was just the dumbest thing. I really did. I was like, this is crazy. What do you mean? Like, why ask people to tell a story in 140 characters? And it wasn't even 140 because you had to like tag it, right? So it was like 130 characters. And what happened was actually the coolest thing. And so I was wrong. But what happened was that this community of people kind of found each other there. And people used it as like a getting going thing in the morning, or, you know, sort of like a warm-up exercise. They started communicating with each other. There was like this cheering section of people cheering and retweeting each other's tweets. And then eventually, and it was a bunch of people who didn't know each other, you know, it was one of those internet things. They had like a get together at an AWP conference. And then we did at I forget, it can't have been the 10th anniversary. We did an anniversary, our 50th issue. We did a thing. They co-wrote a piece about they called each other, they made a collective, they called themselves Fred, who was one of the tweeters. They collaboratively wrote an essay about the CNF tweets and sort of like what makes a good one and what doesn't work for one. And it was amazing. It was so cool.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been really fun.
Yeah, so this whole little community sprung up from that prompt. Yeah. That's amazing.
It was really cool.
Really
so I was wrong.
That's okay. Forgive you.
But yeah, you do see though that with those two, like a lot of them, I think someone mentioned like vignettes, even in, you know, 280 characters or 270, whatever it is, that you see like kind of what a story has to do. And really a lot of them, the ones that fail, they don't, and I think it's some of the same challenge with nonfiction, right? Is it's kind of really broadly a blend of a story and some reflection or some kind of meaning. And so a lot of the tweets that we see, because we download them all and kind of vote on them for the issues. They're on the back page of the magazine, and we pick, I don't know, 20 or something like that. And our staff kind of, we vote on them. And some of them, the ones that usually don't succeed very well, they are just an observation. And so, and sometimes they're really, you know, interestingly written observations, but it's just sort of like, you know, the rain, something, 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 the end. And those don't usually work. The ones that do are the ones that kind of juxtapose two things, you know, and so it's like something happens and then kind of like the observation or, you know, an action and a reaction in like a really tiny space, but they can't have to do those things.
Yeah, that turning point or epiphany.
Something. There has to be some kind of like switch, right? And if it's just something that goes in a straight line, you're like, it doesn't do anything.
Less haiku, more epiphany. Yeah, interesting. And so we had another question. Can you think of a piece recently that surprised you in its approach to a kind of common topic that you were particularly excited by, or maybe not recently, but just in general, if there's been a piece that like really kind of blew you away in terms of how it approached a more familiar topic?
Yeah, it's tricky because so I'm putting the finishing touches on this issue, which is sort of a best of, because it's our 75th issue and it's right before we're going to change the magazine. But there's this one piece that I've talked about before in it, but it's I don't think I have it right. Do I have it right here? I'm like sitting in the middle of this giant stack of magazines. It's really cool. And actually, speaking of hermit crabs, it was for an issue we did on the weather, and here we go. It looks like this, if everybody can see that, kind of.
Oh, wow.
It's called Recorded Lightning, And it's kind of a braided essay that has 3 strands, and they run down the pages kind of like lightning, which sounds really dumb, right?
Like, sounds great.
it does, but it's unlikely, right?
Right.
It's a little bit gimmicky.
It definitely can fail.
It could definitely fail. And I think I remember reading this one for the first time, and I was so excited because the way it goes, and it looks kind of visually interesting, and you have to figure out, do you read it across? Do you read it down? And you read it down, and actually the 3 strands are very different. And it gets to the end of the first strand, and there's sort of like kind of a cliffhanger. It's like it's such a clear invitation to go back up to the second strand. And so that was one thing where I was like, this is awesome. Okay. And then the second strand is a whole different thing. And it also like nailed the whole ending. And I remember just being so impressed when I read this essay the first time, because I was like, she did it. Oh my God.
That's amazing.
It so easily have gone the other way, Right. And it didn't. It was great. And it was also an interesting essay because it was one of, I think, it's one of the strands is all about lightning. So there's a lot in it about kind of being hit by lightning and what that does to your body, and shapes of lightning. And then there's the middle strand is really just about kinds of lightning, which it turns out there are so many kinds of lightning, directions, electricity in the air. I learned so much.
Yeah.
But it was also an interesting piece in the sense that because it had these physical constraints where everything had to fit in the space, we have a pretty robust, for a literary magazine, fact-checking process at Creative Nonfiction. And it's partly because of that misconception that like the creative is, just making stuff up. And so because of some stances we've taken on that, we've developed over the years this process that is really things that are verifiable will verify. And it's also partly, I think, because we have a real commitment to, technically we're an educational nonprofit. And so we have kind of a lot of commitments there, but I think also we tend to work with a lot of writers who are either kind of fairly early career, or because of the kinds of issues we do, where we invite like doctors to write, or we publish, I would say percentage wise, a little bit more writing by people who don't necessarily identify first as writers. And so given that people maybe need a little bit more support there, and also because writing nonfiction is like juggling 25 million balls, right? So like you're keeping a narrative going, there's like a reflective element, there's some connection to a bigger picture, and then sometimes there's like we publish a lot of work from people who maybe aren't specialists in fields but want to write about like brain damage. And so kind of really quickly, you go down a wormhole as a writer, and you're like, here's how the brain works. It's really easy to just get a little in over your head that way. And so I think partly, part of an editor's job really is to kind of make a writer put their very best foot forward. And you kind of do that as an editor a little bit invisibly. And so I think fact checking is really part of that, so that we try not to let people get away with, not get away with, but try not to let things slip into writing. And I think part of that process was also so I've been at Creative Nonfiction however long now, but in that time, we've kind of gotten better at that, because we had a couple things where we didn't fact check things, and then people write and they're like, this writer said this was this year, but it actually wasn't that year. And it doesn't look good for anybody. Like it's not, if you can avoid that, it's better. Anyway, so this lightning piece, there were all these facts about lightning. And so as we went through, some of them were like weird or not quite right, or, a little bit like can't verify this. And so that was an actually really interesting case of partly they just needed to be interesting facts about lightning. Like it wasn't an argument about lightning. It wasn't that they needed to be specific facts. And so that was, I think, one of the few experiences I've ever had where it's like, you just have to find something different that fits that space and is equally interesting. Which is not always the case. A lot of times people are trying to say something about brain damage or whatever, and you're like, that's not the right thing about brain damage. You have to figure out how to make that right. And this was like, that cool fact isn't going to work.
Right.
Find something else to fit in there. Anyway, it was a really fun essay.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I imagine sometimes writers are trying to use a fact because it fits in thematically or symbolically, but it's not actually factual.
Right.
So that presents an interesting challenge to your genre, because it has to be both factual and it has to work with the larger aims of the piece.
Right. And sometimes you're like, this just, I don't think it works. Like the connection you're trying to make here, it just based on the actual information, it doesn't fit in there. Yeah.
So that made me think of a question, which is how much you all will work with a writer on a piece. Are there pieces that you accept? Where is the line? At what point will you accept a piece because you love it so much? There's something there, there's some potential, and you'll do back and forth editorial work with a writer on it, or versus we're not going to take this because it's not ready. And are there pieces that you've put sort of extensive editing into, or do you not do that?
No, we do. I would say we have a pretty intensive editorial process. Again, most pieces that we publish go through kind of the same process, more or less, which is that right now I do most of the working with writers. And so we'll accept a piece, and then I'll send, the way I do it, I'll send a Word file. I'll send 2 Word files actually to people. And so I kind of make a pass through, and the first time it's kind of like, except in like really extreme circumstances where bigger things change, which happens sometimes, and I'll talk about that. But I'll track in suggestions. I track in everything. I'll ask questions. Sometimes I'll move paragraphs around. Sometimes, sometimes we'll cut sections. Sometimes if things are long, or they kind of go in a different direction that maybe doesn't make sense, I'll suggest kind of moving things around. And then with that, I send a version where I accept all my changes. So it's like a clean copy, and it has some of my notes in the margins, but I'm like, here's a clean copy. Because one of my goals, again, it's like that kind of slightly invisible, backstop, is that one of the nicest compliments I ever got from a writer, I think, was, she said, like, I've worked with a lot of editors. You made me sound more like myself than anybody. Which I think is kind of the goal, right? And again, writers are juggling all these things, and it's sort of like, is the brain information right? And is the story moving forward? And do the verb tenses work? And does the logic of like what it all adds up to? It's a lot of things. In practice, most people are really good at some of those things and like less good at some of those other things. Like it's a lot to juggle all those things at the same time. So my goal, what I tell people, I'm like, start with the clean version. And if you see spots where you want to go back and see what I did to it, or where you want to backtrack, then look at the thing, because track changes, if you track changes in a thing, it gets messy really fast. And so partly it's, here, writer, I don't want writers to open the thing and have that experience, that you have in high school or whatever, where you're like, oh my God, it's so red everywhere, right? And half of it is just like italicizing things, but it looks like this giant mess of things. And so I just accept all my changes. And ideally, what I hope happens is that the writer reads it and goes through their version and is like, oh, this sounds really good.
Right.
So, and then there's some kind of back and forth, so if there are bigger problems, we work on that. I usually send another version. And then once we have things pretty set, in most cases, it goes to our fact-checking team after that, which is mostly our volunteer interns. We teach them, at this point, our associate editor, Chad Vogler, is really great at teaching fact-checking. He's got sort of a whole spiel he gives them, and they do a lot of the work there and looking at things. I send any questions to writers. A lot of times, there are usually some questions, research heavy pieces. We try to tell people in the submission guidelines to keep track of their research. Ideally, people do that. Sometimes they don't, and it gets a little messy.
Yeah.
And then after all that, we have an external copy editor who really looks carefully at sort of, formatting and just last copy editors are just really picky and sort of read every word really literally. And so it's good to have a last set of kind of fresh eyes. And
yeah, that's great. I've seen so many lit mags they're just rife with typos. So it's really great. I mean, you're producing like a high quality professional magazine.
But it's slow. I mean, it takes a long time, but I think, again, because I've been doing this for a long time, I mean, I guess it's like what, 16 or 17 years or something like that. At this point, I do take more pieces that need a little more work, and it's partly just because we have sort of the capacity to do that, both in the sense that the whole process of, having like fact checkers who can jump in and having like good copy editors and all of that, but also just, I have, after this much time, sort of a certain capacity that I wouldn't have had earlier, I don't think, in my career, to be able to look at a piece and sort of feel like, well, there's a lot of promise here, but what's not working is that actually this whole third part should really be where the thing starts and rearranges. And so in a lot of cases, I will take pieces. Often it's again, in the context of like having these theme issues, it's to be able to kind of include perspectives or voices that are less obvious along the way. So we did a Let's Talk About Sex issue, for example, which we had talked about doing for a long time, and then finally we were like, all right, I guess we'll do it. The reading was not awesome. Also, everyone has herpes. There were a lot of herpes essays. Everyone gets really upset when they find out they have herpes, but then they realize that everyone has herpes. It's okay. Right. And there were a lot of those essays, but my point is, like, how many of those were we going to publish, if any? Like, not 5. But there was a piece by someone who is I'm going to forget the phrasing, but he's a therapist who helps people have sex, like a partner or something. I forget the official terminology. Anyway, the first version of his essay, which was all about sort of working with this man, he's gay, and he was working with this man who was in middle age and had not been able to come to terms with the fact that he was gay, and so he'd never had sort of sexual surrogacy, had never had a successful like sexual encounter with a man, and so working with his other therapist and with this therapist, which is fascinating, right? Like, so interesting. For the first version, it wasn't very well written at all. It was very, partly because he was a therapist and he had done all kinds of school. It was very clinical. It was very, sort of dry. It just wasn't great, but it was so interesting. And so in that case, I wrote to him and I was like, I'd like to talk to you about this story. And as it turned out, he was like a really charming man. I mean, again, as you'd sort of expect from someone who like got into that line of work, like he's a people person, he's like very communicative, sort of all those things. So we had this great phone conversation. I tried to explain to him, well, really, creative nonfiction would sort of like tell the story, and sort of, there are kind of these hints of it on page 4 and page 6 where it's a little more narrative, but it would be a lot of that. And thankfully, I mean, he kind of went back and rewrote the story, and it was a story. And from there, it was a little bit of an editorial heavy lift, a little bit more than it would normally be. But yes, it was like sort of worth, taking that time and putting in that effort to say, like, this is really interesting. I'd love to have this story for this issue. It's just the way it's written. It's not, it doesn't fit in our magazine. But yeah, I mean, that required sort of like an amount of time and attention and resources that, again, like, we're kind of fortunate to have as a slightly more established organization, and, sort of all those things that a lot of lit mags just don't have that bandwidth,
Is there work that you'd like to see more of? And is there work you'd maybe like to see less of? Maybe fewer thumb-sucking pieces? Or is it hard to say? Does it all just depend on how it's written?
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're always sort of hoping, you know, it's complicated because it's also like an economic thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's complicated because I think, you know, in some ways our preference would be, you know, with True Story, we got some pieces that are sort of like long form journalism, really.
Mm.
And we're always kind of hoping that like awesome, you know, in-depth journalistic pieces will come in. In practice, they mostly don't. The ones that do, it's because they're a little bit quirky or weird, and honestly, they're just not the kind of story that someone could sell somewhere else.
Mm.
But like long form journalism is also, you know, we pay people, we try to pay people as well as we can, but it's not, it's a complicated economy, and so to sink in the kind of time and effort that it takes to write a really awesome long form journalism piece, right, it doesn't make sense for it to end up with us unless it's kind of an oddball, quirky piece. And with True Story, which is our long form little magazine, that has worked, I think, because we've gotten these oddball pieces that were just sort of obsessions that people had. In one case, there was a piece that kind of grew out of a New York Times piece about these brothers who made an album in the 70s. And the writer went and interviewed the family and sort of did all this stuff for the New York Times, and then just was so taken with them that he kind of like, you know, couldn't shake the story and wrote this really long thing, which then he was like, I have this 12,000 word story. What do I do with it? Because it's sort of, there's not a lot of place for that. So, so it's nice. So yeah, I mean, I think we're always looking for things that sort of are a little bit more in depth or are a little less, you know, we'd love memoir and personal essays, but ideally like pieces that get a little more outside the writer are things that we're always hoping for more of, but I also understand why we don't always get them. So,
and how do you choose your theme issue? I'm really interested in this idea that you went back and sort of changed the theme retroactively after seeing the types of submissions that came in, but I suspect that's probably not common. So I'm really just curious how you choose your theme issues, and do you ever accept a piece that might not be right for a particular theme, but you will hold on to it, maybe hoping you can work it into an upcoming theme issue?
Yeah, we're trying to figure out how that works, because I think the themes are going to be a little less prominent in the new magazine, but it's complicated. It's complicated then to sort of like figure out where all the pieces work. I would say too, because we've had all these different submission streams, like we were like short pieces, long pieces. We are also sort of reading across categories all the time. Like, well, this is like a long piece, but it doesn't feel like the long piece, but maybe it fits here, but it's really like an intensive process.
I'm sure.
That's complicated.
Yeah.
A lot of the themes, I mean, we come up with themes several different ways. Generally, we've done one issue a year that's kind of like a reader's choice theme. And those in practice have been, we let people vote on them on Facebook or, you know, like in our newsletter. A lot of those have been kind of really broad themes. I think people vote often for the theme that they think will be the best writing prompt. So we did sort of a starting over issue. We did mistakes. You know, they're kind of like broad appeal, not really focused kind of things. We also sometimes just pick themes. So sex, we were like, okay, fine. Fine. We talked about it for a long time. We'll do it.
People want it.
And the other way we get themes, which is sort of, again, goes to like our nonprofit model, is they come with funding. And so partly we get a little bit of funding from Arizona State University, which is where Lee is currently teaching. And he's teaching in a sort of, they have a lot of collaborative centers there. It's a big interdisciplinary kind of place. And so he's involved in a center that involves, part of what he's interested in doing is helping science policy people use narrative to better communicate sort of the importance and scope of their work. Yeah, so we've done a number of issues that are sort of a little bit sciencey. So we did like a a dialogue between science and religion issue that was had some funding from the John Templeton Foundation, and that's a case where we can usually we get funding which helps offset the cost of the magazine, and also usually pays kind of an essay prize and things like that. So that's kind of nice. But it also has let us tackle, I think one of the things that has made creative nonfiction stand out a little bit is that we have done issues about like science policy, or we've done sustainability issues, things like that that tackle areas that people are not necessarily otherwise organically just kind of writing creative nonfiction about, you know? So that's been nice in terms of kind of encouraging different kinds of writers, but also encouraging potentially different kinds of writing, or pushing the bounds of, you know, pushing the bounds of the genre so that it's not like creative nonfiction, that's like memoir, you know? It can also be kind of, I don't know, travelogues or dealing with science or sustainability or things like that. So
do you anticipate doing a pandemic theme issue, or is that just too obvious?
Yeah, I don't know. The pandemic stories are tricky. I mean, it's so weird.
They're pouring in regardless what the
well, so before True Story went on hiatus, that was kind of one of our submission streams that was open. And so I was reading, and it takes a long time to read, partly because we have this complicated reading process. So somewhere in fall, I guess, I got to, you know, like March, and all of a sudden it was these essays that were sort of like, we're trapped, we're locked in, you know, and by fall already, it was such a different world. And so I think it's going to be really interesting because I don't actually know what happens to us collectively, you know, having gone through an experience like this. Like, I think there was a great essay somewhere, and I don't remember where, but it was sort of about, you know, the 1918 flu and how sort of absent it is in some ways. Like, it didn't become kind of like a big thing people wrote about. But then it's sometimes like a weird background thing. Like, I think it's in Virginia Woolf somewhere. There's just sort of little throwaway sentences about like having been ill, you know? And I don't know what we do with it. I've heard from people who work for fiction magazines that the fiction has gotten real weird, which is interesting. Yeah, I don't know, but I do know that the essays where people are sort of trying to work through, you know, obviously the internet is full of different kinds of nonfiction that are like, you know, about women and jobs and kids, and we've all read those, right? But the more literary, slower finding meaning, we might just not be there yet. I don't know, but there's so much to process. I don't know. It's gonna be really interesting.
Yeah, it does seem like it would be sort of redundant to have a theme explicitly devoted to the pandemic when people will just be naturally writing about it and exploring it for probably a long time.
For a long time, right? I feel like potentially sort of for the rest of our lives, right? Or not, or it'll just, because everybody went through it, it just, I don't
it's just kind of background noise. It's interesting. I know there's one, but what you're saying about the Spanish flu is really interesting. There's one Lauren Groff short story that came out in the Atlantic like 10 years ago, which was phenomenal. I think it became Best American Short Stories, and it takes place with the backdrop of the Spanish flu. But that's the only thing that I can think of in contemporary literature.
I really, I don't know. And I mean, I think you see it a little bit even in that kind of shorthand thing, right? That we have where, what is it? You know, it's like in brackets, like shrugs, all this, right? Like in some ways, maybe that's all there is to say, because the people that I'm seeing who are trying to sort of exhaustively sit down and write out like all this, it doesn't work. I don't know why it doesn't work. it doesn't work.
Yeah, maybe we're still
yet.
in it, or it's too like head on right now to look at it. Interesting. So can you give us a sneak peek of what your next theme issue will be, or is that top secret?
It's not top secret. It's just I don't know.
Oh, you don't have
we are working on some kind of issue about water, but I don't actually know what that's going to mean.
Right.
But it's because we're working with someone at ASU who does sort of like a water project. So
it must be cool. Yeah, it must be cool to say, okay, here's our theme, and I don't know what that means, but I'll know what it means once I get the submissions in.
Partly that too, yeah.
Yeah, and so the writers are sort of dictating like, okay, this is what people are thinking about in terms of water.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and part of it in doing the call for submissions, right, is setting up constraints to make something interesting, right? And so for example, like when we did the sex issue, which is not my favorite experience. I don't know why I'm talking about it so much, but we knew, for example, that we wanted to have a let's talk about sex issue as opposed to like a rape issue, which would be like a really obvious direction, right? And it is not an unimportant subject, is not, you know, sort of all those things, but is different. And so then the thing in writing the call for submissions is sort of being like, here's, you know, leaving it open enough for surprise, but also trying to be a little bit clear about what you're not looking for.
Right.
Yeah.
And so your call for submissions, it goes out, and you, it sounds like you do accept mostly work from the slush pile. You're not soliciting work from like famous big names.
We almost never do that. Yeah.
Okay, that's fantastic. That's great. Any other questions in the chat? Feel free to type them in at any time. But I also just wanted to briefly touch on, because Creative Nonfiction Foundation offers so many other programs, so I don't want to neglect those. So people know there are online classes, there are self-guided courses, and now there are webinars, which is a newish thing. Manuscript consultations, and there's an annual writing conference, which you guys did not do this year, correct?
We did not do this year. No.
Are you thinking about it for next year, or still?
We're thinking about it. We had actually been looking at sort of moving to a slightly different model. So we'd been doing a conference that was in downtown Pittsburgh and was, you know, 250 people for a long weekend. We had done Memorial Day weekend for a long time, and then last year, fortunately, we weren't planning for that at all. Partly because we had some other projects, and partly because we were trying to kind of reimagine it. It's a lot of work for, even by nonprofit standards, just not a lot of money, which doesn't mean there aren't reasons to do it, but it was a lot of work that took, you know, I think we figured it out. It took like 800 hours of staff time or something to kind of throw this whole big thing. And at the end, we looked at the money and it was like $5,000.
Yeah.
Which again is not no money, and it's to have an event that earns money as opposed to losing money is great, but it was like a lot.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
So we were actually looking at kind of moving to a model maybe that would be several smaller events, but more intensive, you know, so sort of smaller groups of people who can work together in different ways. And we had been kind of planning out what that would look like, and we hadn't quite set a schedule or reserved places, thank goodness. But I also think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens kind of in the after, in the sense that you know, things like this, right, where people are all over, are really nice. I think everyone, you know, obviously we're all zoomed out, but I also think people's Zoom muscles are stronger than they were. So, you know, and there's something awesome about it. I mean, there's something, our webinars, you know, there are people from all over. I mean, really, really all over. And it's not, you know, the strongest connection, but I think there are ways to build things where people can connect. I went to Barrel House. Well, you've been to Barrel House's conference that they do normally at Chatham University, which is here in Pittsburgh. And they put together a conference. It's pretty affordable. It's great. They always have they're really fun and kind of low key.
Yeah.
But they sold out all the spaces they had. I forget how many people came. And they were, I did manuscript consultation type things. But the people I talked to were all over and would never have driven
to
Pittsburgh. And so I just think in some ways the amount of access that you can give people online. So I don't know if in the future, if that looks like having one in-person thing a year and one online thing a year. I think hybrid things maybe get weird, but I also I heard people didn't hate AWP, I don't think.
Amazingly, for the first time ever.
Right. I mean, but it did sound like, of the people I know and saw who kind of went to things, they were like, oh, this is actually really nice.
Right. It's tolerable.
You can go to lots of different events.
Yeah, I mean, I totally relate. I'm a mom. I haven't been to anything outside the city in a really long time. So it does create this new layer of access, which is really cool. So that's definitely something to think about.
Right. So much less expensive than schlepping to LA for 4 days to there are a lot of good things.
I'm not wearing shoes right now.
Right.
It's really nice.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but that's it's an interesting challenge for planning.
Totally.
For us to kind of think about
right.
Well, who can come, who can't come, what can you do online, what can't you do online, what do people really want? Yeah.
Absolutely. That's great. So I think I didn't even realize we actually went a whole hour. So this was really fun. Thank you, Hattie. Just one more final question from me, and unless anyone else has questions, but how could people, you mentioned becoming a reader, that you had a lot of readers for the magazine. If people wanted to get more involved sort of behind the scenes and become a reader for creative nonfiction, is that an opportunity that's available?
Yeah, I think we have spots. I'm a little not clear exactly how that happens at this point. But yeah, you can email our general email, which is information@creativenonfiction.org, and Chad will answer and probably have some questions and hook you up with stuff. But it is, whether it's creative nonfiction or another journal, I think mostly places are looking for help reading.
Absolutely.
And it is just a really good way to kind of see what comes in. And I think it makes you kind of a little bit, if you're thinking about writing or looking at your own writing, it is helpful to see sort of where, not the competition, but
what's out there,
to see the field, right? To see what else people are sending and what people aren't sending, and to think about sort of how your work fits in there.
And are you open for submissions now?
We are not right now.
Okay. So where should people be on the lookout for upcoming calls for submissions?
We're also rebuilding our website.
So not there, which I should say is creativenonfiction.org.
Yeah, it is. We have a monthly newsletter that goes out. That's probably the very best thing, because it always has calls for submissions, but also sort of new publications, new classes, kind of all the things are in the monthly newsletter. That is the best.
Okay, so subscribe. Subscribe to the newsletter. And you used to buy ads in Poets and Writers. Do you still do that?
I think when we have calls for submissions, we do classes.
Okay, and stuff. Twitter, obviously follow Creative Nonfiction on Twitter.
Instagram, Facebook, whatever your social media poison of choice. We're not on TikTok yet, but the rest of them we're there.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I can't. Pinterest? I don't know. No. Okay, well, I think we will wrap it up there, but thank you so much, Hattie. This was super informative and fun, and everybody should get their hands on the latest issue, Creative Nonfiction, Moments of Clarity, and check out the magazine.
Yeah, this was super fun.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you all for coming out. Thank you so much, Hattie. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.
All right. Bye.
Down the street sometime.
Yes, sometime. All right. Thanks, guys.